I don't know, man. I don't know anymore. Hey, it's a Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I talk to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. I'm looking right at you, right in the eyes. Thanks for listening. Seyward Darby makes her return to the podcast. Her new book, Sisters in Hate, American Women on the Front Lines of White Nationalism. The kind of book you want to read to your kids before bed. James and the Giant Peach, Sisters in Hate. It's an incredible book. Bleak as hell, but incredible. Beautifully written, tightly written. No fuss, no muss. She tells it like it is. Lean. That's how I like to describe how this thing is written. Dives into the people who are soft so they can say hard things, as one of Seyward's main characters. Not man characters. Main characters says. Keep the conversation going on Twitter at CNFPod. Why? Because I'm wasting no time this week. This conversation is raw, unedited. Didn't have the time to do it, so whatever. If I sound like a moron, well, that you know why now. And we're getting right into it because I'm going to spare you my usual bullshit for this week. So here we go. 1 and a 2 and a riff. You know, I know, like, you and your husband are both writers, and you both had books come out. So what has that been like, you know, the fact that the two of you had books come out at roughly the same time?
Yeah, well, actually, his book isn't out yet. It's coming out October 13th. Yeah, I just promote it along, like I'm promoting it constantly. So you have very good reason to be confused. I don't think that people normally promote books this far in advance, but I'm just so excited that I'm constantly talking about it online. But yeah, I mean, you know, we were certainly writing the books at the same time, and we've been together a long time, over a decade, and he's been writing full time since 2011, and you know, editing is my full-time job, and then I started working on this book about 3.5 years ago, and it's been interesting. I mean, we did not know that our books were going to come out at the same time, roughly. Initially, we actually thought they were going to come out the same month, which would have been insane. But then, you know, they were spaced out more like 3 months. I think one of the most interesting things about the whole process has been the fact that, you know, I wrote a nonfiction book, obviously, and my husband writes fiction. So he has a novel coming out. And just in parallel, seeing how different those processes are, you know, for instance, him slaving away to perfect a manuscript before even sending it to, you know, agents and then publishers versus, you know, me throwing together a proposal and, and being like, I promise I can pull this off. Yeah. You know, all that kind of stuff. And then, you know, the similarities, like he had an incredible copy editor. And, you know, the kind of copy editor, frankly, you know, every magazine should have. So yeah, it's been interesting. And, you know, his book will be coming out at a pretty crazy time politically. And mine came out at a very crazy time I mean, I guess it'll still be crazy when the public health stuff will still be crazy in October, but yeah, I mean, nobody expects to birth a book into the world when there's so much chaos.
In what ways was it helpful to have your husband, Corey, correct? Is his name?
Corey Sobel. Yep.
Corey. So in what way, what was that like to be both writing books at the same time, and maybe even the fact that he was writing fiction and you were doing nonfiction? Like, how did maybe that piggyback off each other as you were, you know, creating both of your works?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I learned way more from him than the other way around, especially because he has been doing this for so much longer. You know, he has figured out how to have a day job, so to speak. I mean, he's an independent contractor, but he, you know, has other people he is responsible toward, and has those hours of his day, but he's always been extraordinarily disciplined about building a writing schedule for himself and being so committed to it. And so, you know, I was certainly, when I especially as I got into the real thick of book writing as opposed to research for the book, he was very supportive in helping me figure out a schedule and helping me stick to it, and reminding me that if I had said these are the hours when I'm going to be working on the book, not to beat myself up when I wasn't in those hours, because I think a book can be this all-consuming thing. And when you set a schedule for yourself, part of that is to actually have the time to write, but then the flip side of that is to not be mad at yourself that you're not spending all of your time writing. So I think I definitely learned a lot from him, just from the standpoint of how to structure my days. And then certainly, we each read each other's work, and that was massively helpful. I'm not a fiction writer. And so, reading his book, I went through it kind of like a nonfiction editor, and then vice versa, so I was probably helpful for him with things about, consistency or structure to a certain extent. And then with me, he was so helpful with the prose, and pointing out where I was overreaching or not saying enough. And yeah, it was a very organic kind of process relationship. I don't know. I can imagine a situation where our house could have been a very stressful place while we were both trying to finish this. And we certainly were stressed out, but not with each other, and I think that we were also always really good about okay, we're going to sit down for lunch every day at the same time together. And, at a certain time of night, we're going to stop working and, just be together. And I think that kind of having that other person to hold you accountable to those schedules was really, really helpful.
And were you still editing the Atavist full time while you were writing your book and researching it?
Yes. So I took 3 weeks off, so essentially a long vacation, to go to the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts last August. And my book was actually, the manuscript was due in October. So the whole idea was kind of this full on 3 weeks. I got off social media. I didn't check my work email. Nobody was allowed to call me during the day, all that kind of stuff. But that was really the only time I took off. The rest of the time I was full on at the Atavist. So, I'm lucky. The Atavist has been a remote operation for many years, and we're owned by WordPress now, obviously. And the thing about WordPress is also entirely remote distributed. And so one of the nice things was I didn't have an office that I had to go to from 9 to 5 or 10 to 6 or whatever. And so, I could be flexible about saying, okay, I'm going to start my Atavist workday a little later and work a little later. As long as I was getting the work done and getting the hours in, it didn't quite matter when they were. So I don't recommend working full time and writing a book. It's very hard, but I was lucky in that my job allowed me some flexibility just on a day-to-day basis so that I could make it work.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people who listen to this show, especially, they have their day job in book dreams or some other kind of dream. So it's kind of good to hear that someone who I find is as accomplished as you, is such a sharp editor and such a brilliant writer, that you were able to thread that into your daily life and to build a practice around it. So I think it's inspiring for people to hear that. So how did you fall into that and into the right practice that allowed you to, generate the research and then, of course, generate the prose that you needed to hit your deadlines while also holding down your full-time job for the most part?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're very kind to say such nice things about me. I appreciate that. And I don't know, initially I was doing so much information gathering. And so, certainly that meant some on the ground reporting. I had a reporting trip that I had to go on out to the Pacific Northwest. But I actually remember, I would spend my day reporting, being with, the subject that I needed to see. And then I would come back to my hotel room and I was actually editing a Josh Dean piece for the Atavist. And so I would sort of switch gears, from asking lots and lots of questions to reading about North Korea. and editing a piece about North Korea. And I think that, in an ideal world, that kind of situation, I actually remember my husband saying when I went on the trip, he's like, it's so cool. You're going to be reporting all day, and then you're going to come back to the room and you're going to write and you're going to, get everything down and reflect on the day. And that it was not like that at all because I had this other thing that I had to be doing when I got back to my hotel. And so I think that, more than anything, I just kept trying to remind myself that there's no precise right way to do this. And that, for instance, because that was my husband's kind of romantic idea of what nonfiction reporting is like, didn't mean that if I, wasn't executing it according to that vision, that there was something wrong. And so, especially in the first couple of months of working on the book, I, just did tons and tons of information gathering, figured out a filing system on my computer where, everything could go. And at that point, I really wasn't writing that much. Like I would write little snippets sometimes because I would just, have something that came to mind that I felt like I really needed to get down on paper or on my computer screen. But I, was just really focused on gathering as much as I could. And then when I actually started writing, and I would say this was like, I don't know, maybe like, let's see, book was due in October. This was probably like February, March. And I actually benefited in this very strange way. I applied for a grant, which I did not get, but that's okay because the grant required me writing about a third of the book because
nice.
you had to submit, a certain number of pages, or I forget exactly like what the parameters were. But my editor encouraged me to apply. And so I kind of had to fly through writing a big chunk of the book. And I think that in some way, and that was definitely just, I did Atavist stuff most of the day, and then I was doing that on nights and weekends kind of thing. And I think that was beneficial not only because it, forced me to actually, sit down and do the work, but I think it also showed me, because I was so worried after all of that information gathering that I was not going to be able to put it all together, that I didn't have a coherent way of saying what I wanted to say. And so in some ways being under that pressure to, get something together for the grant, which I obviously edited it before it ultimately became part of the book, but I don't know. It was kind of the push I needed to get outside of my own head and actually start putting things down. And then after that, a key thing, the way the book is structured, it's divided up into three main parts. And so I tried to, really take each one individually. And I gave this advice to somebody the other day, and it's something that I hadn't really thought of before I started working on the book, but I tried to work on whatever section, of one of the given thirds of the book, I felt most inspired to work on in a given day. So like if I woke up in the day before, I had been writing, I don't know, the third chapter of section 2 or whatever. And I was like, but I've just been thinking a lot about this thing that I know comes in section 6, but I just want to do it. And I feel like that to me, I was following my own like sense of, direction, but also directions on following my own sense of direction. That's the most like tautological, I don't even know. But anyway, what I mean is like I was kind of following my gut almost. Like if I had this feeling that like this was the thing I wanted to work on, that was better than trying to force yourself to work on something that you weren't feeling that day, if that makes sense. Right. And I found that also, especially, when I was figuring out okay, I'm going to work 3 mornings a week from 8 to 11 on the book and, all day Sunday or whatever. I can't remember exactly what my schedule was. And then, Atavist stuff the rest of the time. I think that it made those chunks of time more enjoyable, as opposed to, if I felt like I was really stuck on something or there was a problem I was trying to untangle, I could come back to it. And I think that everybody writes differently. I can imagine how that wouldn't work for some people who need to just kind of proceed according to plan. But I kind of worked according to what I was feeling inspired to work on a given day. Yeah. And then the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts really was so amazing for me. I just, got up every day, 7 days a week, and went to my studio and worked all day, and had no interruptions. And I was able to knock out, at that point, I had about 2/3 of the book written. So that was hugely, hugely helpful. But yeah, I mean, again, I do not recommend trying to work a full-time job and write a book. But it, it worked out. And I also think that, my topic was pretty heavy, white supremacy, light stuff.
Yep.
And and I think that there was something to knowing that I had other creative things happening in my life. So working on Atavist stories with writers, that had nothing to do with my book topic. Like, I actually think it was probably almost cleansing to me intellectually to go and work on, a story that had nothing to do with, the women of white supremacy. And so, I mean, maybe this is just me in retrospect being like blessing in disguise, but I do think there's something to that.
In what way in what way is being an editor at the Atavist and the kind of deep dives you do with these long form pieces, how has that strengthened your skill as a writer?
Yeah, sure. I think, I got a really good piece of advice from my agent, actually, really early on when I had just submitted the book proposal, or I guess it had just been sold. And he said, a book is not magazine stories strung together, unless it's literally an anthology, right? That a book needs to hang together in a way that, a magazine story does, but at a drastically shorter length. And he works with a lot of magazine writers. And he said, they feel very comfortable in these like little, focusing on little bits, right? By little bits, obviously, I mean thousands of words, but, the 5,000 word feature or whatever. And he's like, and sometimes chapters can start to just feel like magazine articles that have, been compiled into a book, basically. And, and so he was like, so avoid doing that, basically. And so I definitely tried to avoid doing that. At the same time, I certainly think that, working on long form pieces at the Atavist gave me a better instinct for structure. And I mean, I know my book, some people, like, one of the criticisms some people have given about it is that, they feel like the structure is actually a little loose. I mean, I personally disagree, but that is their opinion. But I think that, transitions, for instance, like transitions from one topic to another that would not seemingly go together, but needed to go together because, when you started to unpack whatever that second topic was, you realize how much it connects to the first. I think being the editor of the Atavist has really given me a better instinct for how to do things like that. And I mean, certainly just for building a scene. And often, building a scene where you wish you had more detail, but you've got to, squeeze as much as you can out of relatively little. And that's something, in any magazine writing, but certainly in Atavist stories, we're always seeking to do. So yeah, instinct for structure and transitions, better with, wringing the details out of things. And then I also think, I think Atavist readers are really smart. They don't need their hand held through everything. We are not a publication that has a nut graph that basically tells you what the story is going to be about. I mean, some of our stories have that, but we're really telling a story and unpacking it as we go. And in a book, you obviously have, or not every book, but my book and lots of books had an introduction where you kind of framed everything. But at the same time, realizing that like your reader's smart enough to, you don't have to point out explicitly every connection, every way that something they just read, has to do with something they read 50 pages ago. And I think that that's one of the things I kind of love about Atavist stories is that you definitely need to read them start to finish because you can't get the highlight at the top, right? And I think that books are similar. And Yeah, so it also just made me. I mean, the Atavist. Gosh, I think the longest thing I've worked on at the Atavist was like 25,000 words, and
Wow.
even working on, and the book ended up being like 85,000, 80 or something like that, between 80 and 85,000. And on the one hand, that's 4 times longer than, or not quite full time, 4 times longer than the longest Atavist story. And yet, having dealt with that many words definitely made, 80,000 words feel less daunting. Um, so yeah.
The structure was something I wanted to talk to you about. Okay, you have, Corinna, Ayla, and Lana, and to me, there was like an escalation of intensity
Mm-hmm.
to the characters, and maybe an escalation into your approach to them. And I was wondering, like, what was your motivation behind the way you structured it? How you decided to slot them aside beside each other, and what the calculus was among your three big pieces.
Yeah. So structure was really hard in this book. And it was actually something that my agent and I grappled with a lot, even in the proposal phase, because initially the idea was, so all three of these women, Karina, Ayla, and Lana, they were all born in early 1979, which was a nice synchronicity, but also not, it's not like I went looking for that. I just realized it as I was sorting out who I wanted my main subjects to be, that they had all been born around the same time. And so originally the idea was like essentially telling intertwined stories. But what I quickly, so, from 1979 to the present, basically, like using their collective arc, if you will. Um, and, uh, and what I realized the deeper I got into research was that it just didn't make sense. I mean, first of all, there were, it's hard to intertwine stories that don't actually intersect. Like
Right.
in a physical, tangible way. But then on top of that, I just felt like their stories each had such distinct themes that tied into wider topics that I was interested in with regard to white supremacy in America. And so I started to realize that their stories each represented different things thematically, and so maybe that was the way to think about them, was to let the stories build on each other as opposed to intersecting with each other. And so the way I realize that sounds super ambiguous, so I'm going to try to be more concrete as I explain each section. But so Karina is the first one I talk about in the book, and you could argue that she's the most extreme because she's just made a series of life choices that the average person might find deeply weird. So she, in addition to being a neo-Nazi for a time, which that's a lot, she also is a professional embalmer. She was an amateur bodybuilder. She was briefly paid to be in torture porn. She ultimately left neo-Nazism and is now a Muslim. And the way I actually found Karina was an old Gawker article from like 2010 that had described her as the Renaissance woman from hell. And I wanted to put the most extreme person, or the person who seemed the most extreme, early in the book, because I wanted to try to beat back the notion that she was somehow unknowable, or like so deeply unlike anyone you've ever met that there's nothing to relate to there. And so I wanted to kind of put that up and knock it down. And I hope I did in the book, by showing the motivations for the various choices she's made, and how they all certainly intersect with the reasons that she got into neo-Nazism, and then ultimately left the movement. And she also provided, because she's both radicalized and then ultimately de-radicalized, and so her story was a very helpful entry point to thinking about some building blocks of the book. So what is hate? What do we mean by hate when we say that? What are the catalysts for radicalization? What are the catalysts for de-radicalization? Kind of going through these, I don't know, it's almost like the fundamentals you're going to need for the rest of the book. And then as I moved into Ayla and Lana, I wanted to, again, move from the person who readers might think of as the person they can't imagine knowing into the people that they can imagine knowing. So Ayla is married with 6 kids. She used to be a feminist. She holds 2 degrees. She's accomplished, and she also radicalized. And so, looking at the reasons for that, and also she represents some themes that Karina doesn't in the same way. So, for instance, the ways that motherhood and sort of traditional classical white femininity and religion can be weaponized by the far right. And then moving into Lana, who I think arguably is the person, at least to me, who felt the most familiar, just in terms of, I feel like I know people like you. I feel like I know people like you who have the same ambitions. They just happen to, not be avowed white nationalists. So, she runs a business. She's traveled the world. She, is married now and has 2 kids, but didn't rush into that. She, is in some ways like more feminist than she would ever admit. And she was a chance to really dive into the ways in which white nationalism can be an outlet for making a profit, frankly, in the digital age. She runs a platform that she and her husband make money off of, and also, kind of competes would be a strong word, but they think of themselves as something along the lines of InfoWars or another, alt news site. And so she was a chance to look at the internet, at disinformation on the internet and how that's deeply intertwined with white nationalism. But then also because of the rather prominent kind of position she has in the movement, not only because she has this platform, but because she's invited to speak at conferences, she's interviewed on other platforms and podcasts and things like that. She was a chance to look back in time at other women who, in various iterations of the far right in America, have, inhabited similar roles as, figureheads and organizers and communicators and all these different things that I think women are often not given credit for in this space. So yeah, I feel like, they each definitely have their own arcs, each of the stories, but if you read them together, or at least I hope, I feel like the structure subtly builds, and I do think it definitely got scarier to me, and I feel like I'm glad to hear that you felt similar, that there's like an intensity that builds. And I think part of that is because Karina's left the movement, Ayla and Lana have not, and so you're moving into stories of people who are still active. But then again, I think it's also this aspect of familiarity, of seeing pieces of people in them, and I think that certainly, to me, was one of the scariest parts of doing this research.
Yeah, because what I would say with Ayla and Lana, it's like there's sort of an insidious nature. Like, you don't know that could be your neighbor harboring these views that are just hiding under a rock. And since their guy won in 2016, it's like that rock got kicked, and all of a sudden, it's like, oh, they've been around the whole time, and now we're starting to see this, especially in Oregon, especially with a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests and the anti-protests.
Yeah.
We're finding just who the racists are around here. And it's, as you know from your reporting, the Pacific Northwest is almost like a racial hotbed.
Yeah, absolutely. And it has been for quite a long time. Yeah, I actually recommend this book. I've been recommending it to a lot of people, but it's called 100 Little Hitlers, and it's by this journalist, Eleanor Langer, and it's about the 1988 murder of an Ethiopian immigrant in Portland. And it was like one of the worst hate crimes in the city's history and led to all of this really important important court proceedings against a very prominent white nationalist on the West Coast. But her book is just a masterful work of reporting, and I think does a really nice job of capturing, that particular moment in time in the Pacific Northwest, but also, the roots of some of the radical right that exists out there.
Did you consider putting Karina last because she actually got out? And in a weird way, that's kind of like a good outro that of these three, she got out, and that's sort of a good coda to the book. Like, did that ever cross your mind?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was something I talked about a lot, actually, with my agent, my editor. And there were a couple of reasons I decided against it. One is just that she ultimately got involved in the space in the far right a couple of years before the other two women. And so she had radicalized and de-radicalized before they were even really getting into it. And so there was a kind of historical issue there that if, I had jumped back in time suddenly toward the end of the book, I can imagine how it would have felt jarring. And then the other issues had to do with the fact that the iteration of the far right that she was involved with, predates the so-called alt-right, and is a much more classic version of digital neo-fascism. She found out about white nationalism on Stormfront, which has been on the internet since the mid-90s, and kind of ran with people who had been figures in the movement for a couple of decades at that point, whereas Ayla and Lana sort of represent more of the far right as we know it, particularly like in the post-2016 era. Or that's not fair to say post-2016, because I think that I would say maybe from like Dylan Roof onward, I feel like there's been this recognition of like this online ecosystem that nurtures these not just hateful, but wrong, like just factually wrong beliefs. And so again, moving Karina behind that, I think would have there would have been so many things that Karina's story about history, that Karina's story elucidates, that I would have had to build in some other way. So the book, though, does originally, I had, and I know you've read it, but I have something in the conclusion that was originally in the Karina section, and I decided to move that to the conclusion on the advice of a couple of people who read the book. So like her story picks up in a sense at the end, just a little bit, but there was like one piece of her story that I wanted to keep for the end. It's so funny talking about structure, because it's also like just something that I hemmed and hawed and cried and, berated myself over trying to figure it out. And I will say this, like, I kind of resisted this structure for a long time, because I was like, no, I'm not being explicit enough, or I'm not, I don't know, not giving as many like signposts along the way or whatever. And I kept coming back to it because it was the one that felt most intuitive, and felt like it would allow me to say the most that I wanted to say. And I think that, you should definitely kill your darlings, right, in writing. But at the same time, like sometimes if your gut is telling you that like this is the way to proceed, you have to follow that. And I did. I mean, again, I think it works, but I certainly respect people's opinions who say that it doesn't.
Well, early on, you write that the movement is based largely on need, narrative, and network, and then this quest for personal significance, and that ties in to all three of them so well. So maybe you can speak to that as really something that this book really hinges on and hangs on.
Yeah, no. So that comes from a study. I actually read it when I was out on the West Coast for that research trip. I was in a taco restaurant reading about white supremacy. There's like a whole, there's just, you could probably like plot like various restaurants and bars where like I've printed out something that I needed to read, or, you know, looking at my notes by myself, and then like having some good food. But yeah, it's an article that basically looks at extremism broadly speaking. So not, you know, not just the far right, but extremism in any number of directions and cultures and whatnot. And they boil it down to say that essentially the drivers of radicalization are needs. So if you think of it as everybody has needs, right? I mean, we have needs to eat, sleep, all these different things. But then we also have these more complicated needs of needing to believe in something, needing to feel like we matter, needing to feel like we have human connection, you know, depending on levels of narcissism, like, you know, a need to be superior to. And essentially what these researchers say is that with extremists, there's a need that becomes outsized, basically. So, you know, everybody has needs, some are bigger than others. And in extremists, there's a need that grows and grows and grows to the point that, you know, filling it becomes the most important thing. And this is not necessarily conscious, to be clear. You know, it's not like somebody's sitting around thinking, wow, you know, I really have this like overwhelming need for meaning. I mean, I guess maybe they are, but but I think it's often, you know, more subconscious than kind of laying it out would imply. And so what then happens is they find a narrative to explain their place in the world, to explain the need, to also explain how to fill it. And then there's a network, which is, I think that the researchers refer to it as like an epistemic authority or something like that. But essentially, you know, a network, which can mean literally people, but can also, again, mean like an online ecosystem of information or whatever, where the narrative gets reinforced and reinforced. So, so it's not the kind of thing where like there's a need, you find the narrative, and then there's the network. It's a more sort of like circular nourishment, I guess, where it's like the network is validating the fact that you have this need, the narrative is helping you fill it, and the network is also like reinforcing the fact that the narrative is right and good. And another thing that the researchers talk about is how when the need, whatever again the need is, so let's say, you know, to have meaning or whatever, is so big that people also start to engage in what the researchers call untethered behaviors. So like things they might not have done before, but, you know, whatever it takes to fill this need, fulfill this narrative, they start to engage in that. And so untethered behaviors can, in the context of hate, mean using slurs or committing violence, or you know, even just, I think, like engaging again in that online ecosystem in a way that maybe people hadn't felt comfortable doing before or hadn't thought to do before. And I remember reading this research paper and being like, oh my gosh, this is such a helpful framework, because you can apply it to individual stories and you can start to see how their radicalization happened. And I mean, it's rudimentary in its own way, obviously, but I think that's kind of part of the point, because the thing about radicalization is that it's hyper individualized. Like no two people wind up, you know, a neo-Nazi or a supporter of the alt-right or whatever for exactly the same reasons. But if you look at these fundamentals, they exist. And I think that that's so important. And certainly it was critical for me in figuring out how to tell their stories. Yeah, and then the thing, this is something I unpack in the Karina section. And again, I think that, you know, Karina, who was very generous with her time and was a very like helpful source and willing subject, she was also very blunt about that period of her life. And so I think her story was the one where it was the easiest to map the need narrative network framework onto her story. And so that, you know, really helped I don't know, elucidate the framework in a way.
Hmm. And I know you got to get out of here shortly, so I'll just
No, you're fine. You're fine.
pepper. Yeah. So also of course, at the center of the white nationalism and the alt-right movement are a lot of charismatic male figures. But of course, your instincts were it can't all be male, and of course, the name of the book is Sisters in Hate. So why is it so important for the movement to live? In order for it to live, women play a huge role in the growth of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a baseline of, it's a pronatal movement, where, if the fate of the white race is at stake, then women are necessary because they have to have some babies. And so that's like a super baseline way of thinking about gender in the movement, but it really does matter, because they, hold that purpose very dear. The women of the movement do. But then I think that there's also, well, a couple of different things. Like, women are seen as, keepers of communities, keepers of families, keepers of history. Again, like the way that women are in so many walks of life, they fill really similar roles, in the far right. They're just in a hyper traditional way. But they're key, from that sort of internal standpoint. They're also the most important symbols of the movement. So this idea that, white women are under threat, that their ability to have children is under threat, that, their purity might be violated. They kind of, they are like the beacon that the white nationalist movement holds up. And claims to be fighting for. The 14 words, which is this famous or infamous white nationalist slogan, is basically, we must secure a future for women and children. And that's women as like the ultimate symbols, and of course children are in there too, and we would not have children without women. So but then I think there's another really, really important layer of this, and I think that this is probably the thing that I found scariest, is that women in the movement can, first of all, serve to deny the hypermisogyny of the space, simply by saying, look, here I am. Like, why would I ever, want to engage with men who hate women? Like, that's just silly. And so they can, raise their hand, and people will say, oh, well, interesting. Yeah, you're right. You're a woman. You're there. Okay. Maybe I'm wrong about the hypermisogyny. I'm really reducing this down to like dumb people having conversations, but you get you get the idea. And so, they can kind of serve as that, almost like a shield against those accusations. And then the other thing that they can do, and certainly do nowadays online, is serve as these bridges to the mainstream, because they can say, I'm a mother, you're a mother, or like, I'm a sister, you're a sister. Like, look at the things that we have in common. I just really care about, my kids going to the best schools possible. Don't you? Or, I just care about my community being safe. Don't you? And this is all like the language that, is a part of so many conversations around so many issues in the United States. And they can serve as connectors to the mainstream, with regard to those various issues. And then, of course, they will make race more explicit in whatever their conversations are about schools or neighborhoods or, just national borders or whatever it may be. But they are able to kind of find that common ground with like mainstream white women, in a way that, I don't know, men just aren't as successful at. And if they are, the common ground, I think also often has to do more with like a sense of being embattled or a sense of being angry or whatever. And with women, it can cover a more nuanced series of bases, if you will. So I think that that's an incredibly important role that they play, and they'll outright say it. Like with Lana, the third woman in the book, she has said in speeches, because women are soft, they can get away with saying hard things. And she's also been told in podcasts by other far right supporters, men, you know, you can say things I can't. Like you can basically, like, you can connect with people in a way that I can't. And I think that that is a very underappreciated aspect of the far right. The ways that these women can, you know, find their way into conversations about everything from, you know, homeschooling to resistance to vaccines to, you know, neighborhood watches to, you know, all these different things. So that's to me maybe the scariest role that they play.
And as a you know, liberal feminist journalist, how hard was it for you to resist pushing back and taking the bait?
Oh my gosh, so hard. I mean, I made a pact with myself very early on that I was not going to argue with my subjects, because I knew, based on, you know, having watched a lot of their content and having engaged with, you know, a few of them, that arguing would not help. Arguing would get into you can't argue with a bad faith actor, right? Like when they're arguing, if you try to cite data or whatever, and they just tell you your data's like made up or, you know, something along those lines, like you're at a dead end already, and they want to pull you into a rabbit hole where you start accepting the conversation on their terms to a certain extent. And I didn't want to do that. So I told myself I wasn't going to argue. And for the most part, I think I succeeded. But at the same time, I was telling someone this the other day, a friend, there are a handful of mostly waiters and waitresses in different parts of the United States who, after I was in a really tough interview, or not even necessarily an interview, just like I had spent my entire day, you know, watching YouTube videos of these people saying things that were just out, not just like, again, it's a combination of both. Oh my God, I cannot believe they just used that language. But then also, no, that's just patently false, you know? And so you have like these two kind of like your like ethical indignation and then like your, you know, intellectual indignation all at once. And I would, you know, go get a drink or do whatever, go get dinner. And I'd be like, so hi, you don't know me, but I would really love to talk to you about my day. And I think part of it, there was actually this one day in Seattle where I'd had a really tough reporting day, and I was like, I'm going to treat myself to a really nice sushi dinner. And so I went and I sat at like the omakase bar or whatever. And there was a couple on one side that was there for vacation and a couple on the other side that was there for a birthday or an anniversary or something. And then me right in the middle, sandwiched. And after like one glass of wine, I was like, friends, you don't know me, but I'm going to tell you all about my day. And what's crazy is that people were always so like generous and actually interested. And oftentimes like I you know, things came out of those conversations that were valuable for the book. But I think that that's a very long way of saying, you know, I found ways to get the frustration I felt from not arguing out. And then certainly my poor husband has heard me rant endlessly. So thank you to my husband and the various waiters, waitresses, patrons, bartenders who were there for me in my times of need.
Well, there's that Krakauer quote that you cite. It was like a narcissistic sense of self-assurance displaces all doubt. Yep. So you just can't argue. You just can't.
You can't. There's no way that you can. And if you do, I mean, of course you can, I guess, but it's just not, it's never going to end in a satisfying way, because they are coming to the table on a different level than you are, and like with just a different worldview, with different data, with different, it's not just opinions. And so arguing, ultimately, if I had argued, I would have gotten less information, because we, you know, would have gotten stuck, you know, I don't know. Yeah. Arguing about like black on white crime and like what statistics actually show. And then suddenly, you know, my time that I have with them is up, and it's like, oh, well, crap, I didn't get to talk to you about any number of things. So yeah, I just bit my tongue and then talked nice wait staff's ears off.
Awesome. Well, the book is just the leanness of the writing. It's tight. It's great. You tell such a great story about such a deep, dark material and important stuff for us to hear at this time, especially as we head towards a very pivotal, maybe the most important election in a 100 years.
Right.
Who knows? So in any case, Seyward, thank you so much for the work and for all you do with Atavist, and of course this wonderful book that you wrote. So thank you, and best of luck with it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Hey, you CNFer, fellow CNFer. Thanks for listening. I mean that. Some people say that perfunctorily, but I really mean it. I'm feeling a bit down of late, and it's nice to know that I get to have this interaction with you. I don't have many people to talk to, so at least I get to hang with you at this time of the week. Thing is, the analytics tell me nobody listens to the end of the show, so these words are likely bouncing off the wall and hitting me right in the face. So, I guess I'll just say this. If you can do, interview. Goodbye.